Morning. Welcome. It may be afternoon or evening where you are because, of course, this is an international seminar and we are so glad to have you with us. Welcome to the Lean Innovation Educators Summit. It's December 16th, 2020, and we have a community of people gathered together. On behalf of all my co-hosts, I want to welcome you on behalf of Steve Blank, Pete Newell, Steve Weinstein, and myself, Jerry Engel. Today, we have a large community of over 1,000 folks potentially gathering, and so we have to follow a few rules of the road. One, please keep your microphone muted while you're not speaking. Please use the chat function to engage with us. It's going to be actively monitored by Emily McMahon, and she'll be raising the issues with all of us from the chat. If you're having tech issues, please reach out to Nicole Liddell, who will monitor also the email communication. Thank you also to our organizers, the Global Consortium for Entrepreneurship Centers, VentureWell. Both of these organizations were great in helping us get the word out. And of course, to the Common Mission Project, which is our administrative backbone and really enables us to put on the seminar. Also, thanks to those of you that have volunteered and stepped up to chair our breakout rooms. It's going to be a key part of our program to engage with each other and have peer-to-peer learnings. And all these breakout room leaders are going to report back to us on the key points developed during their sessions. So, why are we here? Who is here? And what are we doing today? We're here to continue the learning that we've been doing in now our third session. So we had the first one last December, then the second one in the summer, and now this is our third. The theme from the first was, hey, let's build this community. And we laid a good foundation. The theme for the second was converting to online, from the stress and displacement caused by COVID-19. How could we as educators learn to convert our experiential learning methodology to an engaged online method that would continue to have this in-depth and invigorating learning experience? And we had the second theme of creating equal access to opportunity in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. I think we've succeeded in both these dimensions and are making progress. There's a long way to go, but we're making progress in going online. Most of us have mastered it. And we see throughout the curriculum that we get to see casually and formally a lot of attention being paid to diversity and inclusion. So what are our themes for this session? Moving forward, we want to examine not just how we teach, but also how are opportunities changing for the teams we're teaching? How has COVID-19 and other economic shocks shifted the opportunity platform, shifted the opportunity canvas? And are there things we should be doing to help our students succeed in the new normal? Are there new pain points? Are there new specific crucial pivot points that we need to help them pay attention to? And we want to look at this through two lenses, not just through the high-tech, high-potential lens, which is sort of a natural for all of us, but also through the Main Street lens. This theme of build back better. We really want to focus on helping our teams be important to their communities and helping them build resilient, robust communities as we go forward with this new environment that has been disrupted by COVID and may be suffering risk of future shocks that we can't currently anticipate. So who's here with us to explore these themes? Well, we have over 1,000 registrants from over 220 institutions and 65 countries. Really very diverse and very broad reach. And we're looking forward to learning from all of you. So what's the agenda? This morning, we're going to be listening, and then this afternoon, we're going to be sharing. When I say this morning and this afternoon, I mean in the two segments of the program. I don't know what time of day it is where you are. But in the first segment of the program, we're going to be hearing from the leaders, if you will, not just the leaders of this program and coordinated co-hosts of this program, but from educational leaders like Lee Bollinger, the president of Columbia University. Then we'll be hearing from a panel of outside financing experts, a panel of venture capitalists who will, and government funders, who will tell us how they see the environment shifting and how they've modified their strategies and their approaches in response to the disruption. Then we're going to shift to our peer-to-peer learning in breakout groups. We hope that we're going to be able to keep the breakout groups to no larger than 20 persons per group. We think we'll be able to achieve that. Some of the breakout groups are going to have themes, like there's a special breakout group for hacking for oceans and hacking for recovery. And those have been pre-registered, I believe. And other breakout groups will be more eclectic and respond to whatever are the critical points that the discussants in the room want to focus on. So again, we're going to drive down deeply on how to build back better, how we can best help our students succeed in the new economy. Whether their dreams are high-tech or Main Street, how can we as educators help them to build resiliency, to build the ability for impact, and to strive and achieve the outcomes that they hope for? So why is this so important right now? When I thought about it, it almost came across to me as like the tale of two cities, right? It's the best of times and the worst of times. We're seeing not only this initial job loss, but we're seeing this residual job loss in the low-wage worker segment of our economy, that we have really almost a permanent displacement right now. While in the face of that, we still have the stock market driven by the tech stocks, going to all-time records. Now, how can this make sense? You look at early stage financings, and it's still up and to the right, whether you're looking at deal size or valuations or number of transactions. We're seeing strong, robust, resilient capacity of the tech investing community, to participate aggressively and continually in hardly has skipped a beat with COVID-19. And how does that make sense when we have other trends in the baseline economy that are much weaker? We look at the S&P 500 as an indicator of where has the economy positioned itself overall. And we see that the companies with the largest market caps are fundamentally technology companies. And when you look at the makeup of those technology companies, they're being joined by this huge, wide open influx of new IPOs. The IPO window is just incredible just this week with the DoorDash and Airbnb offerings. And if you look at the balance sheets of the S&P 500, you see that they're increasingly dominated by intangible versus tangible assets. The intangible assets, which are representative oftentimes of technology investments. So tech is touching everything. In the face of that, we have bad news from Main Street. We have unemployment, we have business failures, we have shutdowns, and perhaps permanent shifts in business models. The real economy is in crisis. Fiscal response to that, fiscal stimulus, has been of limited effectiveness. We've put money in the hands of people to keep them being able to put food on the table and perhaps avoid total economic disruption, but that money isn't necessarily percolating down to the middle market companies, to the Main Street companies that we need to look to for everyday goods and services. So in mapping, the potential of this crisis, one way to look at it is home loss. Currently 17 million Americans are not current on their rent or their mortgage. And experts have predicted that 33% of that 17 million face foreclosure or eviction in the next 2 months. So even though we're looking ahead to a vaccine, the economic damage is still rolling through the economy. So we need to build robust teams that can weather these economic shocks. So how can we best help our students? How can we best help them build resiliency for impact and good outcomes? So with that, I'd like to turn to Steve. Steve Blank, would you share with everybody your point of view on how we should be moving forward?
Something which I thought was a bad idea a couple of decades ago, which turned out to actually be something pretty long lasting, and that's the whole lean startup movement and lean education. I remember when it was just Jerry Engel giving me the opportunity to teach in lean startup at Berkeley, because he thought I told good war stories, while I thought I had a different idea on how to build new ventures and kind of modify existing ones. And then pretty soon the National Science Foundation and Errol Arkolik adopted this, along with Phil Wallerstein at VentureWell and Babu Dasgupta at NSF scaled this across now today 100 universities teaching what's now called I-Corps. And then, of course, the I-Corps was adopted in the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, and inside the Department of Defense. And then for those of you who are teaching some version of Hacking for Defense, Pete Newell, and then Joe Felter and I basically took the Lean Launchpad and I-Corps curriculum and modified it to solve problems in the U.S. Department of Defense and in intelligence community. And now that's been adopted in the UK and Australia and across the world, taught in 50 universities. And then Steve Weinstein and others basically created variants of Hacking for Oceans, Hacking for Nonprofits. And all of you are now kind of involved in teaching this methodology or parts of this methodology, which is radically different from anything offered in the 20th century. For those of you who didn't have the experience of teaching students, how to write a business plan, you didn't know the joy of lying through your teeth to your students when you knew that no business plan survived first contact with customers, but you were telling them that that was the best that we knew. And so now we're kind of in a new phase. We're kind of, at least in the U.S., in the depths of COVID, but we see the light at the end of the tunnel. As Jerry pointed out, it's not just that we have a vaccine, but we're going to have to build back new institutions, whether they're on Main Street or, where entrepreneurs will live and work, or how investors will treat entrepreneurship is going to be completely changed. And we're all going to be part of that. The next 20 years or even the next 5 years are going to be probably as different as the last 50. And I think all of us as educators will be leading that charge. And I'll leave you with one last thought, is the beginnings of Lean was just one person with one idea. But as I said, there are now close to 500 of you on the line. Every one of you have that next big idea for education or innovation or something else that will change the world and the way we teach. And I just want to encourage you to kind of, raise your hand and step up, and you're going to be the next change agent for building back better. So Jerry, back to you.
Oh, thank you. Uh, Steve Weinstein, please share your remarks.
Hi, I'm Steve Weinstein. Thank you all for attending this. As Steve said, we're approaching, 500 people and hopefully more. I've been involved in expanding the Hacking for X program out into the impact space as we kind of emerge from the COVID. That I'm thinking that we still need to, get back to solving problems in the environment, cities, local, nonprofit, and impact and making an impact. And I've been working in this area recently and have had classes in the Hacking for Oceans environment and Hacking for Cities, Oakland, and other areas. And I'd love to reach out to anybody who's interested in kind of taking entrepreneurship back into the impact space. And I'm working on Hacking for X. In fact, today we have a group room. One of the breakout rooms is going to be focused on oceans. And if you're interested in doing that, please message in the chat room to be put in that room to learn about the oceans and environment space. But thinking about it, we also, Tom Bedicary helped put on a program at Stanford this summer that was hacking for the pandemic and hacking for recovery, also at the University of Hawaii. So we have been taking this model and merging it into other impact areas that we think is showing some real promise, and we're getting some foundation support in this area and others who are interested in expanding. So if you're interested, please think about it that way. I hand it off to you all to start working in those areas, and I'm happy to help. And the Common Mission Project is going to have more and more information and curriculum materials in that regard to help you expand. Thanks, Jerry.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. Good sharing. And Pete Newell, please.
Hey, thanks so much, Jerry. I guess I'll start with this. I think I am fascinated by, I would say, the diversity and energy of the group that we brought together today. But more importantly, Steve Blank and I have had this long-running conversation about the need for a common language around innovation and entrepreneurship, and how it actually solves problems in the public space. And I think, COVID accelerated that discussion, tremendously. It hasn't just provided opportunities to actually do good work for folks in the government, but also to return that investment, tenfold for our local communities. And I can kind of give you the example of, I'm a recent transplant to Austin, Texas, where, they enjoy a considerable boon in large tech companies moving into the city. Fortunately, the boon is landing on top of an absolutely decimated restaurant and travel industry. And, it's, as Sherry pointed out, despite the wealth that we're seeing in large tech companies and investments in the market, there are a whole lot of folks on Main Street that are out of work. What I'm finding in discussions with governments, so the federal government and local governments, is they are under tremendous stress to come up with ways to do the business they were doing before COVID hit, but now with less resources, less assets, and quite frankly, we're unprepared for what it would mean to rebuild the communities from a business standpoint. So, I lay it all out there. Is I think the opportunity to use entrepreneurship education, not just to generate more young folks that are involved in the government, but actually to reach into local communities and start helping them solve some of these tremendous issues and help them build more resilient economies and more opportunities for more folks to come back to work would be absolutely huge. So once again, I really appreciate the heartfelt energy that this group brings to the table, whether you're in the United States, Europe, Africa, Asia, or someplace else. I think the commonality of the problem touches all of us. And what I think, particularly, Jerry and Steve have done over the years, along with you, is build a platform of with a common language and a common frame point that we can pretty much use to do anything we want. And I think that that opportunity is here. With that said, I would love to kick off the heart of the discussion today. And quite frankly, it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce to you my good friend Heather Richmond, who is going to moderate a discussion with a series of venture capitalists who have very different perspectives and backgrounds on how the venture community or the private equity or private capital community is responding to COVID and how they see things changing in the future. Just a couple of words on Heather. I tell you, I can't say enough about the work she's doing behind the scenes for us. Heather is an entrepreneur in residence at BM&T, and as one of the advisors for the Common Mission Project, has built a massive network of investors who are focused in public service, lots of it in national security, but now looking at space, homeland security, and other places where there's a great need for emerging technologies and companies that will service our country. So, well, rather than continue to talk about how great she is, I'd rather just turn this over to her and let Heather take over and introduce her panel.
We can't hear you if you're talking, Heather.
Thanks, Steve. Pete, thank you so much for the introduction. Everyone, hi, Heather Richman, based here in Palo Alto, California. There in the chat, there was somebody who asked for some diversity, so we got you covered. Got a couple of ladies in this one, but I know that my panelists, I'm hoping that they're on board. We're a little early, so I'll do a couple of opening remarks about some of the folks and then have them introduce themselves because I'd rather have you hear from them. But I think something that we've been facing even before COVID was this idea of private capital and how we need to kind of innovate at the speed of trust. And so we've spent the last, I guess, about 2 years really looking at and speaking with and building this network of investors that are national security minded, that are energy and resiliency minded, that are looking at founder health, that are looking at allied landscapes. And so we have, I understand, a number of folks from around the world. Thank you so much for being here. We all need to work together on this. So I'm going to start calling on some panelists, and I'm hoping that you guys are here. And so we're going to start with Bridget. Bridget, are you here?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Great.
Could you just introduce yourself a little bit, talk about a little bit about your background? Bridget's coming from the corporate venture and international space. And Bridget, we'd love to hear about a little bit what you've been working on in your previous life and then what you're going to be focused on to come.
Yeah, sounds good. So I'm Bridget O'Brien. I'm the investment director for Americas for BHP. BHP, I'm actually very new in my job at BHP, just so everybody knows. I'm a baby there on day 10. But BHP is one of the world's largest mining and natural resource company. So BHP supplies major commodities to the market. So you can think of this as iron ore, copper, coal, petroleum, uranium. And I am part of a new effort at BHP to create a CVC, which is a corporate venture capital arm. And our goal as a team is to leverage what's happening in emerging technology and venture-backed startups to help BHP create a cleaner, greener, safer operating environment. And also to look at new lines of business as BHP looks 10 to 15 years down the line as the commodities markets change. So my role at BHP is to help them develop the program, but also obviously to do the investments as we move forward and building our program together. So, what I've learned in my early time at BHP is this is not easy. This industry is extremely hard. It's capital intensive, and there's a lot of severe consequences if things don't go right. And so the sort of opportunity that we have as a team is to help the organization understand the power that venture-backed startups have as BHP tries to innovate and transform its businesses in the future. So prior to BHP, I was at In-Q-Tel. In-Q-Tel is a strategic investment arm of the US government and also has a program with the Australian and UK government as well. At In-Q-Tel, I did a lot of roles, but one of which was I helped establish its Australian subsidiary. And so I have some experience doing international investing and understanding how you can look at venture-backed startups from a global perspective, and some of the challenges a investment fund may have going into a new market and doing investing. So that's a little bit of my background.
Bridget, thank you so much. We're thrilled that you're here. And before I get to Elliot real quick, if you do have questions, I think that Emily's going to be grabbing those out of the chat or out of the Q&A, but feel free to throw them in the chat and we'll address as many of those as we have time for. Elliot, take it away.
Hey, Heather, how are you?
Great.
Well, nice to be here with everybody today. I'm actually calling in from Southern California. Excited to be a part of this. My quick background is I'm a partner at a new venture firm called New North Ventures. And we're really kind of at the crossroads of investing in technology businesses that are kind of dual use. So have both a focus on national security, but also have commercial prospects as well. So we're just kind of getting started. Prior to this, I was the CEO and founding partner at an energy private equity firm called Tragan Energy, based out of Dallas. Did that from 2016 until earlier this year when we sold our assets. And then before that was a managing director and also a founder of a hedge fund called Commonwealth Opportunity Capital, based in LA, in Greenwich, and in London. Global macro fund, investing in publicly traded securities across all different asset classes, and did that for the better part, really from 09 until 16. And at our height, we were managing over $2 billion of assets under management. Started my career from New York originally. Started my career as an M&A lawyer at Cravath back in the late 90s. Was not a good lawyer, so quickly exited that field, and really have been kind of on the business side since about 2000. I've done a series of things. I started my own internet companies, was in the real estate development space, and like I said, for the better part of the past 15 years, have been effectively an investor both on the hedge fund, private equity, and now on the venture side. So really excited to be here. Happy to answer questions and really appreciate the time.
Awesome, Elliot. Thank you so much. Jake.
Yeah, I'm Jake Chapman. I'm a partner at Alpha Bridge Ventures. I guess I'll start at the beginning. So I came to the Bay Area in '99 to go to Cal for undergrad, and I went to Cal for law school. And like Elliot, I went directly into the practice of law at Cooley Godward, where I did fund formation, and quickly discovered that I hated being a lawyer and I was a shitty lawyer because I'm more a big picture guy. When you're a lawyer, you've really got to be a details guy, and that wasn't me. So all of my clients were venture funds. I did fund formation work. I absolutely loved what they were. I was like, how do I get on that side of the table? It wasn't clear that I could do it directly. And in fact, it took me about 8 years. So when I left the law, I ended up founding a couple companies. I took on some operating roles in companies that needed a lawyer, but could also use an operator in something new. So I could pick up some startup skill sets. Launched my first fund about 5 years ago called Gelt Venture Capital. Ran that for a couple years, and then launched Alpha Bridge about 2 years ago with a couple of partners of mine. At Alpha Bridge, I invest in things that fall broadly under the frontier tech or deep tech rubric. So think aerospace, autonomy, robotics. We do a little bit of biotech. It's kind of new for us, but we're starting to dig in. And as you can imagine, a lot of those things happen to touch on national security. In our next fund cycle, I'm intending to invest almost exclusively in things that touch on national security. But for me, I really define that very broadly. So I think of, and I think 2020 has proven this, that a public health investment, for instance, could be a national security investment, or something that helps increase US soft power in the world could be a national security investment. It doesn't have to be your traditional defense tech kind of investing. So that's what we'll be doing in the next fund cycle. And then what we do at Alpha Bridge, I think is pretty interesting or unique, is that when we invest in a company, we really invest in the founders behind the business and their health and their well-being. So one of our partners has a clinical psychology background, and all the founders we work with, we provide coaching to and therapy for if they need it, nutritionists, personal trainers. We really take like a holistic approach at supporting the people behind the businesses, mostly because we realized that it's the people behind the businesses that like really drive the outcomes and that are the biggest risks once you find that technology that works or that product market fit. So that's who I am, and I'm really looking forward to diving in today.
Awesome, Jake. Thank you so much for being here. And last but not least, Kyle.
Hey there, Kyle Teamy with Breakthrough Energy Ventures. I told Heather earlier I was really impressed they found my War College photo. I don't even have that photo. I don't know how you get that photo, so kudos. Background-wise, I was active Army for about 7 years, went over to DARPA for a while, spent about 10 years as an entrepreneur, and then landed on the investing side, first at InQtel, where I learned absolutely everything I know from Bridget O'Brien, which is 100% how Heather got me to be here today. And, and then transitioned over to Breakthrough. I guess from a mission perspective, I went from a very focused national defense orientation over to for many years, and then with InQtel, national security focus. I saw in the chat someone said, it's just the CIA. That's not actually true. It sounds really cool to say that you're the CIA's venture arm, but it's not actually true. InQtel also works with the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, pretty much everybody in the national security apparatus. It's a pretty cool place to be. And then over to Breakthrough, where the mission at Breakthrough is climate change. It's so from national security level to something that has global impacts, and we'll invest in really anything. So we're technology agnostic, geography agnostic, stage agnostic, just as long as it can have an outsized impact on climate. Which, as going back to Bridget's point earlier, it's a tough space to invest in. Lots of hard tech, deep tech, clean tech, climate tech, whatever the buzz phrase of the week is, challenges, but it's fun as hell, and looking forward to discussing it.
Awesome, Kyle. Thank you. We're gonna jump right in. I've got some questions already coming in. So I guess we'll just start with this pandemic. So last March, I know we were all sitting around, investing as usual, and then COVID hits, and I know that here in the Valley anyway, location has been a big part of kind of investment attractiveness, if you will. It's waned a little bit recently, but as far as, and Kyle, you just kind of mentioned kind of geographically agnostic. So how has your take on where companies are? Obviously, people are fleeing Silicon Valley as fast as they possibly can. But Kyle, I'll just start with you. How are you guys thinking about geography different, location differently? Access of teams working remotely.
Yeah, there hasn't been a huge amount of change in terms of where we're finding companies around the world over the course of the last year. The changes things like this, right? So we're all connecting together remotely constantly, but we're still finding predominantly companies are coming from the Bay Area. They're coming from New York. They're coming from Boston. They're coming from Denver. They're coming from some of the traditional and emerging tech hubs. And it usually just has to do with that's where a lot of the people that were described by Jake and Elliot, that's where you find them. And that may change. We've been debating around the office how much of a change we'll see over time because of the pandemic, how sticky, I guess, the changes will be. Pandemics are as old as humanity. They haven't stopped the drive towards urbanization up to now, but who knows, this one might be different.
Elliot, how are you seeing this play out?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. From a geography perspective, I guess I do agree with Kyle. Certainly, over the past 4 or 5 years, I was spending a fair amount of time in Texas. And what I did see there, especially around Austin, is just how many of these companies were kind of setting up shop. And in fact, I was just down in Austin last week looking at a new investment in the unmanned vehicle space. There's just a tremendous amount of kind of enthusiasm that you feel when you're in places that are just attracting lots of talent. I do think ultimately, it's hard to separate geography or traditional geography from the major university centers as well, right? And you think about just how much research and talent comes out of there. And this is why, for example, while I was spending a fair amount of time in Dallas, you're just not seeing anywhere near as much activity there as you would in an Austin. And that's mostly a function of the University of Texas down there. But, I generally would say that, from a geographical perspective, it's interesting to look at places where you're not, from an investment perspective, where you're not competing with as many other investors, right? I think, the trouble, and some of this is changing, obviously, given the pandemic, and I think we're in an environment now that's favoring sort of capital a little bit more than it was certainly a year ago. But, I don't need to tell you guys, right? I mean, if you've got so much money kind of chasing, all the same players, then, it becomes that much more difficult to put capital to work at compelling terms for your limited partners. So I think some of that is shifting during the pandemic, and I think you could certainly take advantage of that by looking at some kind of non-traditional, places. I'm, as you could probably tell from my last name, I'm of Greek descent, and I actually, at my previous, in my previous life as a hedge fund manager, we were doing a fair number of investments in private companies as well. And what I found interestingly was during the financial crisis, which obviously hit Greece and parts of Southern Europe much more, hard than it hit many other places. Many people just sort of kind of turned against those places and said, listen, there's nothing to see here. And it's been a kind of a trend in my background where I'm a bit of a contrarian, and I'm always looking to allocate capital that, in spaces or in people that are sort of out of favor. And what I found when I was over there spending time in Southern Europe was, an incredibly educated class of folks that were quite entrepreneurial and had incredible ideas, and in fact were, living in places where really needed disruption. A perfect example was like in the insurance industry. Like here in the US, we've got companies like Metro Mile and places like that that are really kind of disrupting insurance. But you go to places, that kind of, that seemingly are, developed democracies, but they are doing things, that, in the same ways now that they were doing 30, 40 years ago, right? And you've got really smart entrepreneurs that have great ideas about how to disrupt these businesses, yet really have almost no access to capital, just given where they're located. So I think it's a really interesting point, and something that I have certainly kind of taken advantage of. And, I think kind of smart investors will look at those places as opportunities.
And you mentioned UT Austin, and considering the audience here, kind of university as a hub, is that where investors are kind of naturally? Jake, I'll come to you. Kind of deep tech, I'm guessing a lot of that's coming out of some of the top universities. So how has your thought process changed around geography?
For sure, yeah. So we say we invest anywhere in North America, which has been true. So we've invested in a bunch of companies in Toronto, particularly in the last couple of years. I think immigration policy in the US has driven a bunch of interesting deep tech founders up there. New York, Texas, Tennessee, California, but the majority of our companies traditionally have been in the major tech hubs, right? The Bay Area, New York, or LA. I think that's gonna change. So we've seen a lot of companies in the last, 3 months move out of the Bay Area. I think it remains to be seen if they come back, right? There is some feedback mechanism here in that the cost of living in the Bay Area, like rent is now down 35% in San Francisco, right? So will post-COVID, will people come back to the Bay Area? Will new startups form here? Maybe. I don't think the Bay Area is dead. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but I do think the other tech hubs in the country are going to see a boom. And I think that's really good for all of us. I mean, venture capital is a tiny, tiny piece of private equity, and private equity is a tiny, tiny piece of the capital markets. And we're really not constrained by the amount of capital to back startups. We are constrained by like startup formation. And so it's to all of our benefit if, Kansas City becomes a tech hub, and, Nashville becomes a tech hub, and Indianapolis becomes a tech hub, and Austin becomes a tech hub. Because there's just more opportunity for all of us, right? And that should mean valuations come down, which is good for all of us investors. It should mean more opportunities. And it should mean people are building more solutions to like our real problems. And this isn't COVID related. I also think that I don't refer to millennials. I don't want to be too pejorative with millennials, but I think it's kind of a lost generation. I mean, we certainly had plenty of startups formed by millennials, or we certainly do, but I think it's a less mission-oriented generation than Gen Z is. And Gen Z is really coming into their own now in terms of hitting the right age to be starting companies. So I think we're going to see a lot more from Gen Z in mission-oriented companies, and I think they're much more willing to start companies anywhere in the country. So I don't think San Francisco's dead. I think you can still be an investor and live here and do just fine. But I do think for the next 10 years, we'll probably see all of the tech hubs start to be a little bit more fruitful, and investors might have to jump on planes a little bit more often. Because I don't think Zoom cuts it, but I'm old fashioned.
And there was a comment from Ed saying, from the investor standpoint, why the exodus to Texas? And I think state income tax is probably the 3-word answer to that for the most part. But I'll let Pete comment on that later. And so Bridget, I mean, you've been kind of weathering this, from across the pond, the other pond, I guess, from, from an international standpoint for a while. Can you talk a little bit about Australia's investment ecosystem, kind of reflecting back on your previous life and kind of how you thought about it anyway, and then how that's changed now that you're back stateside?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can just talk really generally about just global investing. As a fund, there's high barriers to investing overseas. And, you're having to navigate new laws, understanding disclosure, and you're understanding there's a lot of sort of tactical things you need to be considering while you're going overseas. So, what I find is what's really helpful is when startups kind of make it easier and you really rely heavily on other co-investors that can help navigate as you're entering a new market. So, I mean, there's foreign investment review boards that go up everywhere, especially these days with, depressed valuations and companies or countries concerned about foreign investment that may have, not necessarily the right intent. And so you see some nationalism in terms of some of these review boards that are going up to protect national security and infrastructure interests. So it makes it a lot more difficult in the COVID environment. And I can speak to that. I've watched that happen as we were doing investments overseas, seeing review boards change, policies change to protect national assets. So, so that being said, it's a tricky market. It's a dynamic market, especially right now, as countries and policymakers are thinking about how to encourage innovation, and also how they think thoughtfully about what kind of capital comes into the country. So that being said, that is kind of there's a lot of opportunities everywhere, and everything's a little bit more accessible through Zoom right now. You don't have to get on a plane. You save a lot more time. I can do deeper diligence on a company. I can spend more time with the other board members to understand what's going on. But I'm really going to rely on those board members and those relationships those board members have with their founders to really understand if that's where I'm going to put the money. In Australia in particular, there is a really dynamic ecosystem. There's a strong national interest to help with promoting the ecosystem. And I found some of the best talent and research in the world in Australia. It is on the other side of the planet, but at the same time, I think looking in those markets is really important because you can find these like hidden gems, and you can actually help essentially promote the company and help them grow globally. So those are just some of my,
No, that's extremely helpful. I'm just thinking, we've got, corporate venture and earlier stage stuff, just as educators here are trying to guide and lead their teams after they've worked their magic. The next kind of place for these teams to go is to go find some money to keep working on the things they're working on. How early do you guys invest? How do you, what sorts of tips do you have, for educators, working with these teams to make sure that, they can hit the ground running, but then keep running as quickly as possible? We've got a race that we're in right now. How do we, I mean, I guess, Ellie, I'll start with you, Ellie. It's just on, I know you've done some earlier stage stuff. Like where do you guys start, and how, what sort of advice can you give?
Yeah, I mean, we start at seed and Series A funding, so we start pretty early. I think, one of the questions that you raised is, on some level, like how, how has this environment kind of shifted some of our thinking, right? And, I think that, and we were sort of moving kind of in this direction anyway, but, you really need to understand kind of who your founders are. You need to really spend time with them. And I think that I have now, and I sort of, I've always done this, but I'm really starting to place a premium on kind of good listeners, founders that are really coachable, and folks that have shown in their career that they've been able to kind of respond in a resilient way to kind of stuff coming out of left field, right? I think like, and what's interesting, and listen, I've got teenage kids, and there's certain, and some of this, I don't know, how far this goes, but there's a lot of sense of kind of this, helicopter parenting and not letting kids fail, and all this kind of nonsense. And what you realize is like it's really kind of not preparing people for the real world, and the volatility I think that we're seeing is only getting stronger and happening more quickly. So when you think about, it's not the guy with, or gal with the highest, IQ points, right, that's going to sort of make it to the end, or necessarily the people that have got the best pedigrees. It's kind of some of these softer skills, around kind of resiliency and ability to listen, and also, frankly, backing diverse teams, right? That where people, there's not just this one dominant personality that's kind of a know-it-all, but it's a group of people that are working together, that are bringing kind of diverse viewpoints, and really challenging assumptions and challenging the direction that companies are in. And I think if you can sort of be a mentor, and you can to folks that are willing, to engage in that kind of behavior, and that are wired that way, I think those are the kinds of companies and founders that you want to back. I found it fascinating what Jake just said about how they approach folks. I'd never really thought about it in that way, but like I think about how much in my own life I've been able to benefit from living a balanced life, and understanding kind of where people are coming from, and sources of strength through meditation, and all of this stuff that I think allows us to kind of attack issues in a much more thoughtful way. And Jake, I'm going to co-opt some of your talking points, because I think it's it's incredibly valuable to be able to provide some of that kind of mentorship to these young founders, and making sure that they're just mentally and physically they're in a good place in order to sort of run their businesses and run their teams. So anyway, I know it's probably a long-winded answer, Heather, but hopefully that kind of shines some light on how I'm thinking about it.
No, it's great. If Jake, you'd just spend another minute or so. It is a really interesting model. When we first spoke, I thought about it for like the next week. Just that you're taking this very interesting approach. Would you expand a little more?
Sure. I'll start with just a quick anecdote, so how you can think about it in a practical manner. So imagine you're the CEO of the company, right? You're a startup, and tomorrow morning you are meeting with the investor who's supposed to lead your next round, and then you're meeting with your most important current partner, and then you have a call with a sales call with another important partner that you're hoping to land. And that night, you and your significant other have a huge fight, right? And you don't get any sleep, and you're stressing about it all day. The lead investor in that first meeting tells you that they're not going to lead you around. They found something or whatever, they're pulling out. And so now you've got to find money. You still have two very important customer calls that day that like actually drive the fundamentals of your business. Like, can you show up for those meetings, and can you be at your best? The answer is, probably for all of us, like, we won't be at our best, but like, do you totally melt down, or can you handle it, right? Like, are you fit enough? Are you getting enough sleep? Can you meditate? Like, do you have the tools and the skills to be at your best? And we want all of our founders to be there. That's the aspiration, really. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the approach we take and what we invest in. For each person, it's totally different, right? Everyone has their own personal struggles. And so a lot of our process when we first invest is figuring out what it is that that team needs, and then build a custom program for them. And then a big part of it also is buy-in, right? So not every CEO we work with wants to work with a nutritionist, for instance, right? And that's fine, right? Like, they have to tell us what they want to improve, and then we work on that aspect of their life. Yeah, and we found it to be super powerful just in terms of driving that resiliency, which again is the thing, similar to Elliot, it's the thing that we most look for. And I mean, honestly, in sort of like a Machiavellian, like cynical take on it, it's also helped us get into very competitive deals, because when you tell a founder, hey, I actually care about you as a person, not just like as a means to an end, which is me to make money for my LPs, like it works magic, right? So yeah, it's been really interesting building this out.
It's fascinating, and I'm guessing, with the extra stress of COVID too, you've had some interesting stories that I won't ask right now. But we had a question actually, just about as specific as you guys can get. And Kyle, I'm coming to you first. I really hope you have a good example on this one. How have business models shifted post-COVID or during COVID? Have you seen companies have to kind of shift their business model, either temporarily or potentially, for the long haul?
I mean, so with the stuff we're investing in, the one area we're seeing that is transportation, and in particular mass transit. We're getting a lot of pitches from folks with different forms of mass transit, where they're all rethinking different aspects of it. There's also been, I think, a heightened awareness about, might say, biosecurity. And so in the agriculture and food spaces, we're seeing the companies we're talking to, and the companies in our portfolio are much more aware of how a pandemic that doesn't directly affect humans, but might affect a crop or an animal, or fill in the blank in biology would impact their business model. So I don't think there's been huge changes here, but those are two areas. I guess one other would be buildings and infrastructure, kind of writ large. There is sort of an outstanding question of how much of a long-term impact there will be from this, right? So, because urbanization is the great trend of the last 4 centuries, like maybe longer. Like it's part and parcel to the Industrial Revolution, and will that actually devolve or not? It's a huge question, and it really impacts the future of human infrastructure, how we build our cities, how we communicate, how we travel. I tend to be more like Jake and think people like to shake each other's hands and give hugs and talk face to face, but I could be wrong.
We're stuck a little now. Bridget, have you had any examples or companies that you've watched either struggle or pivot, or anything that's been pretty pandemic related?
I think every single one of our companies has struggled and had to pivot and think differently about how they're applying and doing their business. I think people have had to make harder decisions. Being in a startup is very dynamic and quick, and you have to make decisions fast. But I have found, just sitting on boards, I'm a big fan of like structured decision making. You can make a decision, but you have to explain to me how you thought through it. And I think creating a framework, and I've been working with a lot of founders, and I can post something on LinkedIn that I'm working on, but how you actually think through structure-based decision making. You're going to tell us you're making a decision. How do you arrive to that decision? And so you're prepared in a board meeting on how to do that, especially now when you have people's jobs on the line. You're thinking about supply chain. You're thinking about the different products you're bringing to market. Mm-hmm. Being more thoughtful. And there's intuition is important, but it's also, I have found that I've been pushing back more on founders about how do they make that decision, and be able to defend it. So those are the sort of things, it's hard. especially when in order to get the venture returns, you need to have a global company. And when you are stuck in your country, or you can't travel, or you can't go meet with customers, or you can't go to conferences, you need to get creative. And so creativity, I have found in my companies, has been spectacular. And one of the things that I've been trying to help support, and even doing brainstorming ideas with them on the side about how you can think differently about your customers and engagement, and even the way you produce material, training material, all those sort of things. So long story, my short answer is it's hard, but
Yeah.
it's, you don't go into a startup if you don't think it's going to be hard. And it's going to be a lot of problem solving and a lot of energy, and it's a lot of fun. And I think that founders that I found that take that approach rather than like, wow, this is a lot of work. Mental health is a lot better. And the last thing I'd say is just creating a strong network of people you can rely on to bounce those ideas off of, and to help with those brainstorming sessions so that you're prepared to make the hard decisions.
That's great. And I just want to highlight really quickly, Pete, in the chat, that we are interested in collecting thoughts on recommended government policy changes that might encourage diversity and additional investment in the national or public service industry. So looking at that from a U.S. perspective, you're welcome to comment on that. I just wanted to make sure everyone heard that and saw that. I might be pinging all of you there.
Yeah. There's a lot of bias, right? You can't overcome this cognitive bias. So it's stuff that people need to think about, I think, from a policy perspective, and what biases are being included. And every fund needs to think about that too, as we make decisions in hiring too as well. Absolutely.
Yeah, there are a number of questions here about diversity and inclusion. I don't want to put it on anybody, but if anyone, if any of your firms it's very top of mind, how you guys are thinking about it, would love to hear your comments. Jake?
Yeah, I'll jump in briefly. So I think about it there's two buckets, right? There's diversity at our own firm, so having diverse partners, and then there's diversity in the companies we invest in. Venture firms tend to be small, right? So 95% of the venture market, they're small firms in terms of the partnership, 2, 3, 4 people. And you don't run a hiring process when you're hiring an equal partner to be like the third person at the firm, right? You hire a friend or someone you've known for years. And so it is really hard to quickly bake diversity, equity, and inclusion into the partnership at a venture firm. It's a really long process where you have to expand your own social network, really, to make it work. In terms of investing in founders, I think that's much easier. I think we've invested in something like 40 or 50% of our companies have a female co-founder. Most of them are the CEOs. We have a bunch of folks that are people of color, a bunch of veterans. I think one of the challenges when you are investing in deep tech is that if you look at PhDs granted in the US, like the majority of PhDs are going to white men and white women. There are very few people of color getting PhDs. And then if you bisect it even further, people of color getting PhDs tend to get them in the social sciences. So they are like way overrepresented in education and way underrepresented in physics and mathematics and chemistry. And so I hate to say it's a pipeline problem because that's like the easiest cop out in the world, but to some degree, it's just harder to find folks of color who are building the next aerospace company. And we do a lot of work in that space, but it's much harder. So
I recommend anybody who is interested in that topic to read Raj Chetty's Lost Einstein paper from Harvard, but it really talks about lower income people, lower income children, and their ability to actually enter STEM majors. And that really is the core to the problem. So, if you're interested in that topic, there's a lot of excellent work that's being done by that group of researchers to look at it, to think inwardly about how you're actually approaching the problem.
Bridget, what's the name of that?
I can drop it in the chat as well. And then the other thing I would suggest is if you're not the former head of people for Reddit, she has this really great open source slide that she recommends to founders to present diversity and people and culture to the board meetings. I give it to my companies, but it reminds them to look at their diversity composition every board meeting. And you present it to the board, and the board should be asking questions about that. So I'll put it in the chat. I think it's an excellent slide. It reminds people to have that conversation every board meeting. and it just becomes a good dialogue and tool for founders when they're looking at their teams.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight, there's a comment from Greg in the chat about K through 12 education. And I think just as biotech has now become part of the national security apparatus, much more obviously so, K through 12 education and what COVID has done to that. I think in the equity and the access of that to, for a number of these, populations that are at risk. So national security now encompasses everything. So I think I'm being yelled at that we're out of time. Yep, I am. Thank you guys so much. We could do this for another couple hours, and I have lots of questions also for you. But thanks again. Feel free to stay on the chat and answer some questions. We might have some for you to follow up. But thank you all for the work that you're doing. I know it's difficult. Thanks for being here. We appreciate it. Jerry?
Thanks.
So before we run back over to Jerry, Heather, thanks so much for bringing such a great crowd of folks together. And just a reminder, there is a Lean Innovation Educators Slack channel. So a lot of the links and questions that people brought up, and if if you want to continue the dialogue, I just encourage you to move it to the Slack channel, because that thing is a living, breathing monster, and will keep lots of people connected for a long time.
And thank you, Pete. We'll be posting the link to the Slack channel at the end of the session today, and of course it'll be repeated in numerous venues. I just want to personally thank Heather and the panel. That was really great. You took on some really challenging questions, the questions of geography, of disseminating opportunity and capital throughout the ecosystems and the emerging innovation ecosystems around the world. You took that problem on pretty well. Addressing diversity and inclusion, such an important topic that we have to keep in front of ourselves if we're going to move forward. You address that beautifully. And also the emerging business models that are coming up post-COVID, and how innovation has to lead, not just top down, but very much from the bottom up. So thank you very much. A diverse panel that included, industry and included, people funding startups and later stage. Heather, fantastic. Thank you very much. With that, I want to move directly to Steve Blank, who's going to have a fireside chat. We'll see if we have a fireplace in the background, but he's going to have a good chat with Lee Bollinger, president of Columbia University. Steve.
Thanks, Jerry. And, I just want to remind everybody online, it's just right after Lee is kind of the heart of this conference is the breakout sessions with you guys. So hopefully Lee and I can raise some issues that might be of interest in your conversations. But let me introduce Lee. Lee Bollinger is the 19th president of Columbia University, and interestingly enough, next year will be his 19th year as president of Columbia, and that by far makes him the longest serving president of the university. He's been there since 2002. And before that, he was president of the University of Michigan for 6 years. And Lee, I have to tell you and our audience a University of Michigan story is when the National Science Foundation adopted the Innovation Corps, or I-Corps, University of Michigan was one of the first schools to sign up. So I went there to speak multiple times, and the Dean of Engineering, who had heard me speak there before, always had his head in his hand when I introduced myself as at University of Michigan, saying it was the best school I was ever thrown out of. I enjoyed going there. But everybody should know that when we talk about diversity, Lee, when he was president of the University of Michigan, led the school's litigation in a series of Supreme Court decisions that upheld and clarified the importance of diversity in higher education. We're going to talk about innovation and entrepreneurship.
I'm going to go get a consult for my hair.
We're going to talk about innovation and entrepreneurship in the university setting. And though, Lee, we will get into how COVID has affected Columbia for sure. But when you think about innovation and entrepreneurship, most of our folks on this call, I would assume, are teaching in some form of university or college. And while they teach innovation and entrepreneurship, some of them kind of consider schools as kind of non-innovative and kind of static. And what's really interesting is that I know as an innovation fellow at Columbia, I see the school much differently as one that's kind of creating new things and basically trying to break out of the box of what the purpose of a university is. And so, Lee, as an innovator, why don't you remind our audience, what are the historic purposes of a university, and what are you trying to create and disrupt as a new purpose, as the fourth purpose of a university?
Great, Steve. I'm really happy to be with you. To answer your question directly, and then we can go from there. I mean, we all know that universities are about research and teaching, and we know that the modern system of the research university in particular has been stunningly successful. I mean, it's one of the great achievements of 20th century United States. And so that's really fantastic. People always add on public service, which I think of as a kind of, we're neighbors, we live in cities and we're part of a nation. We should, do good things. I have been thinking about this for many years and came to the conclusion that it would be very important for universities to take on an additional and major role. And that role would be to try to work with outside partners to take academic work, not only at your own institution, but broadly academic work, and working with these outside partners to try to impact and affect the world in good ways. It's what I call the fourth purpose. We have something called Columbia World Projects we set up, which is...
But Lee, excuse me, what are the first three purposes of a university?
Yeah, so research, education, public service.
Bingo, thank you. And now you're creating a fourth one.
Right.
All right.
And, the example that is really self-evident about the fourth purpose, where it's already happening, is with medical schools and hospitals. So not every university owns its own hospital that has a medical school, but if you don't own it, you have an affiliation with one, and part of your mission, your actual mission, is not only to do great research and train new doctors, but to actually implement medicine. And so in that particular part of a university, it's a given that that should be what you do. At the other end are places that I know extremely well, because that's been my intellectual home, like a law school. A law school could have been set up that it has a 500-person law firm attached to it, just like a huge hospital. And it combined the academic work and the teaching along with the practice of law. That would be the equivalent of having a hospital, but that hasn't been done. Other schools, do something in between the hospital and the being removed. We have many faculty that decide on their own that they would like to take their work and have an impact. We have faculty who come together and try to do that. But no university has really said we should design the institution to try to have this bigger impact using academic work, but joining up with outside entities and organizations and partners to do that. And that's really what the fourth purpose is all about.
Well, that's a huge idea. And so take us through the process. I mean, the your entire audience are folks who teach innovation and entrepreneurship, and they're teaching people who have new ideas and get out of the building and like discover what was right and what was wrong and what works and what didn't and what assumptions you had. And I mean, that's incredibly transformative, and that's a big vision. Just like, I hate to say it, just like a startup 23-year-old founder, you now have something at scale that gives you a platform. Take us through what happened, the discovery, the pivots, etc. Because I think this is not only a startup story, but this is a startup story at scale that could transform all of higher education and the purpose of what everybody listening could go do.
Yeah. Yes, I think it could be transformative. Certainly, it will be transformative for an individual university like Columbia if we're successful at this. But the main thing is, would other universities follow? And I think there's good reason to think they will. I think if one looks around in the world, you see these huge problems, massive inequality, hunger, poverty, climate change, issues of how to set up a global trading system, my own field, how do you set up a global communication system? You have national problems. So, there's no shortage of major issues. And then you look at the functioning of governments. And I think, it's fair to say, without being partisan about this, that there's been a real problem of governments delivering policy responses and laws for problems that exist. I mean, I think one of the theories for why there is a rise of anti-liberal or illiberal governments is a failure of governments to deliver for their populations. If you look at international organizations, one of the things that stands out is they're extremely important, but yet they're not able to exert the kind of authority and power to deal with things. If you look at NGOs, they play a very important role, but they tend to be very focused on some particular issue. If you look at think tanks, again, many of them captured by particular interests, and universities have this incredible sort of filled with public purpose, filled with people who want to have an effect on the world. And yet it's odd that we haven't said, let's organize ourselves to do that. I said that we did it with hospitals. There is one other area that's instructive here, and that is the tech transfer offices, the commercialization of academic work. So as you know, and many people on this call would know, beginning in the 1980s, the government said, look, we give enormous amounts of money for biomedical and other kinds of research. Let's encourage universities to try to bring those things to market. And if you do, you can keep the revenues from the licenses and so on. So we set up, and everybody set up, these tech transfer offices. And they go around, they help faculty try to figure out what might be commercialized and actually have a structure for doing that. And without that operation, it would be harder to do. So that's an example of just a subset within the university system where we do this. And my view is we should do it broadly. This should become a dedicated mission of the university, with just as much purpose and resources and design as the part that, is for scholarship or teaching or tech transfer or hospitals.
So Lee, that's an incredible fourth mission for a university. To maybe share with us, when you first had the idea, what areas did you think Columbia could have the most impact in, and what was the process, and what did you discover in your first couple of years of this initiative?
So we're still at the beginning. I have a task force that's led by Ira Katz-Nelson, who's our provost and my provost. And that's going to be issued in the next week or so, I think. It will sort of outline a plan for how to do this more. 2 years ago, I established something called, as I mentioned a while ago, Columbia World Projects. And that really has the mission of trying to do this in a very practical, concrete way. And I can talk about that. And it's now generated a number of, quote, projects. So I think I just, every place I looked, all the people, many of the people I've met over time, if you say, we're Columbia University, we'd like to help. I mean, they're incredibly eager for that to happen. And yet there's not a kind of system you can turn to and say, this will make it happen. So, it wasn't any particular problem. It was just a whole series of them and a belief in universities as incredible institutions with extraordinary people in them and doing great work for research and teaching and not a universal, but at least a majority of people say, I'd really like to have an impact. And so the question is, how do you design an institution to channel that? Now, the problem is in part that universities are really decentralized places. So of all the institutions in the world, I think of universities as at the far end of the scale of decentralization. So you really have, you have to say a university stands for something. A university can do things that individual faculty may want to do or may not do. We can't tell them to do it. But a university is a bigger entity and something that we can act on. So that was a piece of the puzzle. I don't want to go on, Steve. Why don't you, I can take any dimension of this.
No, Lee, this is fascinating because now you've made me think is that, okay, here's this purpose of the university to now be outward facing to make the world a better place. And just as a reminder to everyone listening is that, at Stanford in the 50s and 60s, Fred Terman turned Stanford into an outward facing university, but as an entrepreneurial university to have its students go out and essentially kick off commercialization of university derived technology. But you have a bigger vision of actually taking problems in the world and bringing the university's expertise. And it really sounds like you're struggling whether, or maybe your task force will figure this out. Is this a functional, that is by department, or is it by individual, or is it focused on problems that gets matrixed across different parts of the university? Do you have a feeling or an idea of
right? So you're right, Steve. It's actually each of those. So one dimension is there are faculty who actually do this. They take their work. They're very good at working with outside entities, partners, and making things happen. One of the things that's been striking to me over the course of my career is that those people probably will not get credit for that work in the promotion and tenure process.
Big idea.
And that strikes me as crazy.
Right.
So, if I get a law passed, I'm a major, came up with an idea and it's a really important idea, and then there's a law passed. People say, it's great that the law was passed, but the key thing is you had the idea. If somebody doesn't have the idea but gets a law passed, that person has no chance of getting tenure, even though that law may be really significant, and getting that law passed took incredible talents So one part of this
So,
is,
excuse me, so you're actually good, and I don't mean to interrupt, but you just articulated a pretty big idea for universities where currently it's essentially publish or perish.
right,
Now you're actually suggesting make change or perish, or at least
Yes.
make change now gives you equal credit to publish. Is that
yes,
what you articulated?
that is, well, it's, let me put it this way. It is, we should be prepared to take into account effects on the world of ideas that are generated.
Huge.
And, and, and furthermore, we should embrace in the appointment process people who have incredible talents of that kind.
Wow. Big idea.
So it's not
Huge.
only who can, come up with the best theory for a particular problem, free speech, or come up with a new theory about this, but people who are extremely gifted and talented at making things happen in the world. And I think all of us have known
Excuse me,
people
but it
like
still
that.
just went up the back of my neck on that. People who are talented in making change. I mean,
Yes,
that is the audience that these 500 people on this
I
call
know,
teach to. I mean,
I know.
that is what we do.
Yes,
And the fact that a university wants to encourage that type of initiative, reaching outward,
yeah,
can have a major impact on focusing.
that's right.
That's
And that we would have them within they would have, we would have a cohort of people within our institution who are of equal standing with the greatest scholars and the greatest teachers. But they are, the greatest at having impact on the world. We do this to some extent. That's why it's interesting in a way. It's not like it's completely novel. I mean, the great surgeon, the great lawyer will be an adjunct in the law school. The great business person will be an adjunct in the business school. But we don't embrace it in the way that I'm thinking about. So there's all of that. There's sort of how you treat who do you embrace within the university, and how do you, what do you value? But then there's also, Steve.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is a great point, and I hate to point this out, but I'm sure everybody on this call kind of understands, at least from an educator perspective, that universities sometimes feel like a medieval guild. And academics with tenure tend to protect their profession about how they got their corner office. And you're suggesting slightly, if I was a tenured faculty who got there by publishing, now kind of diluting, so how has this been accepted? And I don't mean to get you off your track, but for this to scale, you're going to have to change the nature of how existing academics view their purpose inside the university, isn't that?
Right. So nobody has higher regard for the person who can come up with a new way of looking at a problem than me. I mean, I'm right up there with the people who say, I marvel at the creativity of the university world, and in no possible way would I want to undermine that or minimize its significance and make it secondary. I do believe that over the past 30, 40 years, universities in many departments and schools and disciplines have become too removed from the fields, from the actual worlds in which their fields relate. And I saw this in law. I started teaching in 1973, and beginning in about the 1980s, law scholarship moved very significantly away from actual problems. And I know this happened in many other fields. And I think that was that had unfortunate consequences. And I think universities, part of my thinking here, Steve, is, in all candor, is that we need, for the best scholarship to happen, to have a closer alignment with what the real problems are in the world and a closer consciousness of those. And that embracing this fourth purpose as a general kind of thing is a way of enlivening scholarship, true scholarship, as well as playing a role in the world that I think the world wants us to play and that we can play well and importantly.
So Lee, what you just said, I want to play back to make sure I understood. It's not only going to transform the world outside the university, but the consequences transforming the university, not just Columbia, but how universities view themselves and their purpose in the world.
Yeah.
Isn't that the consequence of if you're right and
Yeah.
if you manage to pull this off, what happens?
Yes, I mean, I don't want to be overly, I don't want to be grandiose about this. I think it's a very pragmatic, practical, where do you situate in your mind universities in the context of the world? Should they be highly removed and only focused on teaching and scholarship with some public service on the side? Or should they be actively engaged with problems, ready to work with outside people and organizations? The two arguments against this, I think, are reasonable but don't have merit at the end of the day. One is the one you said, Steve, which is if you do this, it will dilute the work being done on scholarship. And I think quite the contrary, it will enrich it and bring new vitality to it that's needed in many disciplines. The second
Completely agree.
argument against it is that it will bring the university into a politicized environment, and politics and universities are dangerous mixes, and you will face retaliation and you will face internal controversies that about which political course you're taking and so on. And my answer to that is there are plenty of problems in the world that need help, and universities could provide some help that are not political. I mean, nobody would say that helping rural communities in the United States with their water systems and figuring out that, or modeling climate change for farmers around the world, that we can do because we've invented, great short-term climate modeling. I mean, these are not political agendas. So I think there's plenty of room outside of controversial political issues for universities to play a role and not be political.
Well, Lee, we're almost out of time. And the good news is we didn't even get to talk about COVID in Columbia and the rest. You have, I'm just watching the chat window here. You have energized now hundreds of innovation entrepreneurship educators, and who actually, a good bunch of them, I'm seeing from the chat, might want to help or learn more or get engaged or figure out how to bring these ideas to their school. How can anybody find out more or help or see if they can model this somewhere else?
Right. So go to the website for Columbia World Projects and take a look at what's happening with that. That is the startup model of what Columbia World Projects will look like. And then we'll have this task force report. I mean, the thing that we didn't quite get to that's very important is that universities, as universities, can also take on problems and organize academic work around that, draw in academics from other parts of the other universities, other parts. I mean, we are working now with a lot of institutions on very practical problems. This Columbia World Projects has been a great success. And it's our best example of what it is we're trying to do.
Well, Lee, this has turned into something that, at least for me, has just been mind expanding. And in fact, as I said, just gave me a thrill that that a university president is willing to act like an entrepreneur, coming up with, another great idea, but this time at scale that potentially could change the world and touch hundreds of millions, if not billions of people.
Yeah.
And so I wish we had more time. But this has been one of the best talks I've listened to, and I'm on the other end of it, so I learned a ton. And
You're very kind.
I'm looking forward to seeing you back in Columbia when we're teaching in person next year. And
Yeah,
thank you very much for your time.
my pleasure, Steve. Thanks for being so encouraging.
All right, take care.
Yeah.
Jerry, back to you. Boy,
Well,
I don't know about you, Jerry, but I just got smarter.
certainly. Yeah, wow, I did too, Steve. And thank you, Lee. That was fantastic. There was a call out from a number of people in the chat room, Lee, if you want to just throw it in there. People are looking for like a buzzword or a slogan, something they can take away, like Build Back Better, but something, do you have a slogan for your fourth pillar?
It's just the fourth purpose. It's
the fourth purpose,
yeah.
colon, we need something after the colon. The
Yes,
fourth
I know.
purpose, colon.
Yeah, we're looking for that, like direct action, or it's we haven't quite got that yet. But fourth
Oh, we're
purpose.
going to use direct action right now, and
Yeah.
then you got to replace it. Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you so much, Lee. This was fantastic. Big thinking for big times with big challenges. This is just what we needed. And it really will invigorate where we're going now, which is to talk to each other. I know we've all, just sticking with the big theme for a minute, we've all read Scott Galloway, who is a Berkeley Haas alum, who I'm proud of, but boy, has he stirred the pot with what is the role of the university post-COVID, and the real disruption of the university business model. Lee's given us a whole new purpose post-COVID, if you will, to engage in the biggest problems with a purpose-driven central to the university. And personally, when I listened to it, I certainly heard in my own experience thinking that our entrepreneurship programs are an experiment in this that we've been doing for the last 25 years. And they can be one place that Lee and his other leadership colleagues can look at for examples of what might work in some ways that can be really scaled, this embracing the community and university interface for constructive outcomes. So with that as a kickoff thought, let's go to our breakout rooms. Now, the breakout rooms are very important, so I'm not going to take a lot of time talking about them. We have 30 minutes for each room. The moderator is going to be somewhat ruthless in seeking real nuggets, because we're going to then have 45 minutes for the moderators to come back and report out on what they gleaned from the 30 minutes of discussion. And so they're each only going to have like 2 or 3 minutes to report out their gleanings. So let's get into it. Reminder that a couple of the rooms have poster sessions in them, just a handful. And those people will be given their 5 or 6 minutes to talk about their specific innovation. And one theme or one room or two have major themes, and those have been pre-enrolled, like Hacking for Oceans. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to the breakout room leads. Let's go to our breakout rooms. You're going to be assigned to them right now. And welcome back. Fantastic. Good ideas, both Steve and Pete. Welcome back, everybody. Let's give everybody 30 seconds or a minute to just stand up and stretch and really reach out for a second after that breakout group. And we're going to start with Jim Chung. So Jim, you have 30 seconds to sort of get your head around it. You didn't know you were going to be first up, but we're going to go down the slide that you're looking at now, and we're going to hear from the breakout groups, and we're going to hear from Jim, then Babu, Todd, Jeff, going down that line, and then we'll shift over to Ali and Philip and Jim going down that side. Okay, so 15 seconds of pure stretch. Stretch out sideways, stretch up high. Yes, I do this in class. If you're wondering.
Best practices.
Oh, James O'Connor, you have a good stretch going. I like that one.
No, thanks for joining the Lean Educators yoga session.
You got it. All right.
I'm always
5,
stiff.
4. Get that stretch in. 3, 2. All right, Jim Chung, are you in the room?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We do. You're up.
All right, great. So our room had a really great diversity of participants, and our focus was primarily on the Main Street questions and kind of the non-traditional groups that we typically haven't spoken about in this particular summit, where we focus primarily on the deep tech stuff. So we were actually talking a lot about pre-university education and innovation. So how do we make sure that our students who may be falling behind and may not have been able to keep up because of the COVID pandemic, how do we make sure that they're on track after we get back? One of the participants is homeschools her kids, and she was talking about how important the flipped classroom approach has been, and being able to use that, continue to use that going forward. And of course, this is something that that we've used quite a bit of in our I-Corps programming. So the importance of that. We also talked about educating people in the prison systems and how what happens to them after they come out. And so we spoke a bit about not just focusing on what's the urgent stuff that we have to do, but with some purposeful planning, trying to make sure that we are adjusting for their return and the return to normalcy after we get back. We talked some about also how do we work with these companies, these startups that are maybe not so much innovation driven but necessity driven because of the dislocations being created by COVID-19 and economic dislocation. So one of the things that we thought that would be increasingly more important, and actually an advantage of having a lot more of this remote technology, is that mentorship becomes a lot easier. Rather than having to get people face-to-face meeting, we're now able to connect people. And in our case at GW, now we, instead of just mentors locally, we are being able to bring the right mentors from around the country or even around the world to help our students with mentoring. So those were the main points that we had time to discuss in our group.
Very cool, Jim. I really like that you went in that direction. Very helpful. And now I know I can poach your mentors. Is that it? Okay, I'm going to break my order that I announced, and I'm going to hop over to Ollie because I think she has to leave the meeting early. So Ollie Hawks, can you go ahead?
Great, thanks. Thanks. So we had a really good discussion in our group. Again, people from all over, which is really exciting. And I think one of the things that struck from people's shared experiences is that there's no kind of common thread of experience that we have seen people experience, like highly engaged teams, highly motivated, taking advantage of being virtual and conducting extreme customer discovery, to the other side where teams who might have started out strong at the beginning of COVID and found it easier to do things virtually have now hit a serious virtual fatigue and are kind of disengaged and not excited about it and just really exhausted, too exhausted to take anything more on. So one of the things that we learned, or a couple of things that we learned from the group, was to really encourage students to learn the skill to consult with each other, which I thought was fantastic. So that kind of shares the teaching experience, but really giving a crucial skill to the students to be able to guide each other and say, well, like, what did you learn about your customer discovery? And what did you learn about the value proposition? And kind of take the role of the educator a little bit. One observation that was really excellent was that conversations have, when we talked about cohesion amongst teams and students, was that conversations have become more one-to-one. That's with the educator and with themselves. And we're no longer having these bigger networked conversations where you can have the serendipitous meet at the water cooler or the trade show and kind of increase the creativity. But because of that, some of these interactions have become more meaningful and purposeful because they're very focused. You know, they're trying to, one of the lessons we learned is shorten the time that you're going to do things. So you can no longer do a full day. You can kind of 3 hours max that you want to do it virtually. But it's forced educators to become much more coherent and clear about what they want to achieve with their teams and their students. But my observation overall, and not necessarily group, so if I got this wrong, sorry, was that it felt like a bit of a decrease of creativity because it felt a little bit more rigid. And then the last two things is just not pretending it's business as usual was a great lesson, and to make space that people might be affected by COVID personally or within their family or wider organization, and to allow that to be a part of the new normal. So to hold space for that. And I think that was raised by one of the first speakers and what they did at their venture capital firm. And then last is just using tools like Mural and Slack to really create that sense of community and ongoing collaboration. So a lot of really good lessons learned and great observations that people are putting into their thought about being an educator during this time. And I will end there.
Oh, that's great, Ollie. Thanks. A lot of things that we're all probably doing, incidentally, but as you're suggesting, maybe we need to be more intentional as we do them and with focus. Thank you very much. Hopping back to the other side, Babu, could I ask you to take next? I see you. You're on mute, Babu. Still.
Okay, sorry, Jerry. Yeah, so in our breakout session, we are focused on the distance learning, some of the issues and some of the good things that worked out. So some of the good things that they liked was being able to institute virtual pitching, virtual customer discovery. Then in some cases, they were able to recruit, host a special session to motivate faculty and students and thereby be able to recruit them. Then in some cases, for the breakout sessions that they held during the Zoom classes, by maintaining the same team chemistry, the same team composition, those breakout sessions worked out really well compared to when they had split teams, different groups meeting different times. And then also reinforcing the lectures with examples during the Zoom session also helped. Some of the issues discussed were, how do you create energy during Zoom sessions, especially during international calls?
With 1,000 people.
I know. The other thing was, one person noted that, there's a drop off in engagement after 1 hour. I mean, and for clarity, I asked, what do you mean by drop off? Basically, they just disappear from the Zoom. And then, another good thing that also came out from this breakout session was to be able to reach out globally, trying to build, engage and build partnership. But the question remains is, what would that engagement and building partnership, especially when you're reaching out globally, what would that look like? So these were some of the key things that we discussed.
Thank you very much, Babu. All these sound so familiar. It's a shame, I don't know if that's good news or bad news. Philip, we'll come back to it. Oh, wait a minute, I missed Chris, and I'll get way out of order here. Chris Taylor, would you go next, please?
Chris is not on the line.
Okay, fine. Then we'll go down to Todd Warren.
Great. We sort of split our time between two questions. The group from around the world. I think actually, which was the distance learning aspect. And I think one of the things we're learning is that remote causes us to lean even harder in on this idea that Steve and others got us doing with flipping the classroom. Like, how do you make your synchronous time more focused on collaboration, both with you and the students as an instructor, but also among the students themselves. And we talked a lot about using collab tools, everything from Discord to Mural to make that even better. The other thing everybody realized was that we can bring more people in from outside the classroom. And that's not only the scaled theorists, like the guy who wrote the Testing Business Ideas book can now appear for 10 minutes in your class, but also your constituents for customer development or with Main Street businesses, other local constituents, bringing those people into the classroom. So that was on the teaching side. I was super interested to hear from a number of the people in the group about how they're dealing with Main Street businesses. And the big thing, and I know I saw this with teams that were serving these customers that I coached in the spring, but Main Street businesses had product market fit, and now they're experiencing for the first time falling out of product market fit. And how do we provide scaled services to help coaching? And in the group, we had some people who had sent their students to help those local businesses in this time of need, and pivoted their classes from doing the next app to helping mainstream businesses do it. And we had people doing that both in Africa and in San Jose, and with Hacking for the Community in Hawaii and going out to rural areas, but still struggles with how to engage, especially with rural communities, to help them do that. So those were the insights from our compacted little group.
So were there any insights real quickly in terms of client acquisition, essentially, finding, people who were willing to accept help?
Yeah, there was an insight that, especially when you go out to rural areas, that that younger people who are already fluent in the tools are more likely to engage. But I would say we just barely scratched the surface of that particular area, Jerry.
All right, thank you very much, Todd. Jeffrey, please.
All right. So we had a wonderfully diverse group. We had folks from Israel, Egypt, Australia, and even 2 different parts of the Stanford University campus. And a few, we did go around and touch on a lot, but didn't get deep with much. But a few key things that I got out of it. One is getting out of the classroom in some ways can be a lot easier when you're never actually in a classroom, in a sense that people are finding lots of welcome connections with folks, and they don't have the same travel and logistical challenges. So they found a lot of ways to connect. Similarly, the idea that empathy and engagement is extremely scalable. So some of the core principles here have really scaled a lot. Also say one other thing that one of our members contributed is that everybody has now lived through a pivot. So everybody has kind of experienced disruption and kind of is now maybe a little bit more open to looking at new ideas.
Great. That's a positive way to look at the changes we're all going through. And I'm really glad to hear it. Thanks, Jeff. Micah Koch.
Thanks, Jerry. We also had a really eclectic and very inspiring group from all around the world. I think one of the things that we heard was, in the online environment, it is a little bit more difficult to gauge feedback from teams. We've had university faculty who said that hybrid classes are probably the most detrimental learning environment, that it's really difficult to maintain that one-on-one intimacy, but Zoom has been a passable kind of safe option, and that in keeping
Micah, I heard part of that conversation when I was hopping around the rooms. Do you want to clarify what hybrid means?
So teaching both in person and virtually. Simultaneously, that's right. Wearing the mask and having cameras, but also people in the room and people online. I think the feeling was that was pretty detrimental to the quality of instruction. I think one of the other things that we heard in terms of the adaptation was just that, it does take teams longer to get interviews. You can't just knock on doors, that part of the hustle of entrepreneurship, which is about, getting into places where maybe you shouldn't be and finding the right people and asking them the right questions, much more difficult when you have to schedule Zoom meetings in advance. The flip side of that coin, we did hear that some people have more time on their calendars. I'm not quite sure who those people are, but getting Zoom interviews is actually easier, and so some of the discovery process has been easier online. But we spent a little bit of time, talking about whether or not Zoom and virtual was actually a good substitute for the in-person, watching people's pupils dilate and describing their problem set. And then, just the last part that I also want to emphasize is, with respect to Main Street, I think what we heard is that, there's a lot of business owners who are really distracted, focused on day-to-day issues, obviously impacted personally. and that looking at all aspects of the entrepreneur has been a real focus, prioritizing the human element, when folks are dealing with layoffs or cash flow issues or potential eviction, that really focusing on what's important and being methodical is a real challenge. And so the approach, I think, has changed from some of the instructors in our breakout room.
Mhm. A lot more flexibility needed. Thank you. Steve Weinstein.
Hi. So our session breakout room was on hacking for the environment oceans, and we had a group where we were somewhat a little bit more talking to the group. But Emily Cotter brought up that there's a program at UCSB, and that there are other programs going around, but all of the coastal universities are finding that taking this methodology should have and hopefully can have impact in these impact spaces, and that these courses are more complex to put on than even the hacking for defense type classes, because you're trying to bring a diverse community together around the class.
Steve, could you give one example in Hacking for Oceans of the type of sponsor that you would that you would have for a project?
Yeah, so they're usually going in a couple of categories. There's one in the the nonprofit area, and also from the foundations, or from some of the coastal conservancy organizations, as well as we found some CEOs who are working in an area that's adjacent to what and they're hoping that people will work with them or help solve some of the problems. So you find CEOs of startups. We work with a couple of those. We work with, and then the standard people who you think foundation people in impact, and third, the groups of the nation, conservancy type orgs.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't kind of branched out to and we had one venture also. There are venture funds that are starting to be impact funds particularly. So it's kind of a very diverse group. These are very big problems, and so you don't normally find the way you can somebody who owns this problem. It's more people working in this problem area.
Right.
Yeah.
That's exactly the issue I was trying to drive at. Thank you very much for sharing that. I just want to mention right now that, because there's so much going on in the chat, we will be publishing a report based on this discussion, summarizing the general points from each of the breakout groups, summarizing the points made by Lee Bollinger, et cetera. So also, what's apparent is there's so much value in the chat. Please load any of your thoughts in the chat with valuable links. Continue to do it, because we may just harvest what's in the chat as well and put a summary or synopsis of that, as well as a list of useful links offered by the attendees in our report. So we have to edit that and look at that, but that's a thought that's emerging today. So please continue that practice. Todd Bache. Are you here?
I am here. Great. I think, like everybody, we had a great group. There were people from all over the world, from lots of different universities, and as far away as Curacao, and we even had a representative from the United Nations. So that was a really interesting perspective.
160 countries.
Yeah. So if you add all that up, right. So that was really interesting to get that perspective as well. Gladys was great. Some of the key takeaways that I think came out of the discussion was, number one, the discussion was way too short. We could have talked a lot more in that breakout room. Usually crisis accelerates certain trends, and that certainly happened with COVID. COVID kind of broke the myth that distant learning was problematic, isn't as effective. It forced everybody into this, and a lot of people came away with the feeling of, hey, for a lot of things, this works much better than we thought it was going to work. So I think that's going to be a carryover into when we can go back, how to use that as a technique and not be afraid of it. People found that they can reach a much larger audience, even a worldwide audience, and that really opened up everybody, the educators' minds to that they can teach not just to this group, but to a much larger group. And it made me think of Teachers Without Borders kind of thing, that that the access is really pushed out to everybody now. Much increased attendance. Team formation was something we talked a lot about. teams usually gel. There's the old forming, storming, norming, performing kind of thing about teams. That happens through working together over time and socializing. And socializing happens naturally in person. You go out to dinner after things, you go get pizza, you hang out. That's much harder to do. So the team formations to really gel as a team can happen in this kind of distant environment, but it takes longer. That's what several people said. It eventually happens if the teams meet on a regular basis and really connect over time. So the bonding does happen, but we need to find ways to do kind of distant socialization. So you're doing those kinds of activities in a way that does gel the team and make that work out. Students often,
and in conclusion,
I think the conclusions are team formation happens, but it happens over time, and you reach a much larger audience. So I think those are our key points.
Thank you, Todd. I'm sorry to have to push it.
Okay. Yeah.
Todd Morrow.
Hi, thanks. Is there a requirement that everybody be named Todd on this phone call?
And all Todds have been called Scott.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. So in my breakout session and in our breakout session, the focus was pretty much on the first part of the suggested topics, which was sort of the mechanics of what works and what doesn't work. And I'm going to try to summarize, and I encourage the folks in the breakout room to holler when I get this wrong. I'm going to break it into three pieces. The first is kind of, what are the techniques that seem to work better in this virtual format as opposed to the more traditional one. And some of those are breaking things into very, very small chunks, bite-sized chunks, 1-minute presentations, not 20-minute presentations for teams, and micro videos that people can watch to learn things. So in addition to a flipped classroom, which I think we've heard several times, it's just making things very, very bite-sized, even when you're all together online. Second idea that popped out was in some of the institutions, they have asked the students to design the class. So you may choose a topic, that's sort of the curriculum piece, but then the students design the class, or at least help design the class. And the argument there, of course, is that's the audience you're speaking to by and large, however you define students, because it can be anybody. And in addition, they are more familiar with some of the tools that are available. And so you get ideas that wouldn't have occurred, for example, to me, an example being having Twitter be an integral part of the class. And of course, there are lots of other tools out there as well. The third piece is finding collaboration tools which can be used both during the, let's call it Zoom sessions, but also outside of class. So ways that the teams can interact or students can interact as well as the overall class can interact, which happens both during the official hours as well as during the unofficial hours. And to the point that Todd just made about pizza, teams have a little more trouble forming and sort of norming under the current circumstances. So providing those tools is actually really important because they can't just go have a cup of coffee after class. They can't all get together at 7 o'clock. They can, but they don't for a whole set of reasons. So that was sort of the list of the mechanical things that help.
Right.
There is a Go ahead.
I'm going to say that getting the input from the students and what tools they're most fluent in is an interesting idea.
Yeah, it's sort of a bottoms-up approach, and I'm sure that you got to corral it to some extent. But having said that, I'd be willing to try. It sounds kind of interesting to me. The second thing, two more things. Just one quick one I want to touch on. There are some very I'm going to call them non-traditional solutions to big problems. So one of the folks in the breakout room teaches at Rio Grande University, UT, which is one of the new universities, which is apparently somewhat spread out around southern Texas. And the students did not have access to good to good internet connections. So what the university did was improved their Wi-Fi so that it extended into the parking lot. Because the assumption was most of the students were going to be coming to class, that is once upon a time, a year ago, so they could drive to the parking lot and then they could get fast Wi-Fi. as opposed to trying to do it from their houses where they simply did not have decent internet connection because regionally, there's just not much internet. So there's an example of something that the institution of higher learning can actually do to facilitate participation without having to buy everyone a router or having to run optical cable to everybody's house. Just a simple thing that really improves the overall experience.
And the final point.
Last point. To a certain extent, we're all fighting last year's battle. Now, if it all changes, we'll go back in person, that'll change. But look, Zoom is simply a classroom. It just happens to be electronic. And the breakout rooms are simply a study section. It just happens to be electronic. You can't, I think you can build an argument that there are more innovative and more interesting ways to do this. I just don't know what they are yet. And so we nibble at that problem a lot, but I can't tell you there are any specific solutions. But just having a bunch of
come back when you have the solutions.
Well, I hear you, but just the Brady Bunch approach doesn't work for anybody, and it ain't going to survive once we figure out what the right way to do it is.
Thanks for the inspiration, Todd, always. Jessica Fields.
Hey, y'all. So we also kind of bounced around a little bit, but I think we could boil it down to sort of 3 key questions that we sort of addressed. In terms of best practices, we did hear the chunking concept that worked really well for students, and also kind of arraying those chunks of information in terms of more of a buffet than a monolith was easier for them to access. Really making certain you boil your class down and reiterate, these are the 5 things you needed to take away from this discussion, because at the end of the day, they are a little bit overwhelmed, and students being overwhelmed was kind of a running concept. But some things that people have done to counter that were actually coming up with a concept called learning in service of the business, and making it very clear what the learning path is towards that commercialization or towards that business development, and also what the different levels of proficiency are for those different paths of knowledge, and just really kind of working with the student or the team to build that concept out and to build that path cohesively. I'd be interested to hear our panelists comment on this next one, but in terms of challenges, keeping mentors and investors engaged over the video was a bit of a problem. They managed to shorten and simplify the prezzies that tended to help, but Q&A engagement is still a little bit of a struggle. So if anybody's got any other ideas on that, please drop those in the chat. The final thing, we really kind of went back to the Main Street and the concept of how do we kind of shift university services and capabilities into helping the Main Street, kind of going from Bollinger's talk. We've seen a few different variations of that kind of already starting in different locations. One I want to call it is the J School developed a COVID pen pal program in Kansas to try and get people to wear more masks, which was really interesting. A number of places are sort of grouping students together in diverse teams of maybe 6 to 8. That also helps accommodate any potential drop off, but connecting them then with a Main Street local business and helping them build out a service. One of these that was really interesting was connecting entrepreneurial students with waitresses and bartenders to help them figure out how to get additional funding to kind of compensate for the lack of subsidies they might not have been able to receive. So really just thinking at granular levels, and it's not always a sexy company that the student gets to work with, but they get to see real impact, and it's something that they can use in their skill sets as project managers as they continue forward. So it's just some fascinating stuff coming out from that.
Those are great takeaways, Jessica, especially like the last one. That's highly original, working with the problem rather than working with an entity.
Yeah, it was real
Their
fascinating.
opportunity. That's sort of a hacking for recovery approach, and that's great. See if Chris Taylor is back. You get one last shot, Chris. Nope, he's adjourned, I guess. So let's go to Philip.
Okay.
Philip, I know you're there. There you go.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Special thanks to Diana Potcher from Spain and Andrew Harries from Canada for taking the notes. Really appreciate that. This will be a reiteration of some of the other points that were made, and I'm just going to go down the list quickly. First of all, it was observed that that the teaching the class is actually better remote. There are some benefits to that. One of which was the wallflowers within the class. They get to use chat versus if it's in person, they're not going to participate at all. In terms of, the lecture, make that available in advance of the class. And one simple way of making sure that, students actually go through some of the advanced materials is to ask students to pose a question. They have to come up with a question, about the material in advance. At least it's, something simple to get them to engage and to go through that advanced materials. In terms of, just reiterating, got to break everything up, 10, 15 minutes, it can't be anything longer than that. Keep everything very, very short. Also, yeah, the guest speakers, it's a lot easier to ask somebody to, come in because they don't have to drive in. They can do it from their offices, et cetera. So you have actually a broader access to more guest lecturers who can come in, which students obviously love. Be sensitive to each of the personal situations. Students will turn off their videos not because they're checking out, but because of their location. You want to be sensitive to that, of course. One way around that is one of the participants in our discussion has a house rule that participation is part of the grade, but when they do talk, they have to put the camera on. So, that's sort of a compromise on the sensitivity. One of the other observations was, I think everybody knows this, as soon as you jump into a breakout, if as a professor, as you jump into the breakout, you're going to kill the discussion. So, perhaps be sensitive, don't jump in, let them finish the discussion on their own. Overall, there's a higher pressure to be more entertaining. When we were talking about the curriculum, that's just something that has been experienced. And in terms of the exams, what has changed is that the exams, they need to be testing more of the understanding and the applications of concept. One of the things that the remote learning has enabled is that you can have an exam, that is open for, 24 hours or 6 hours. And then you're able to actually ask the students to demonstrate more of the understanding of the concepts. One thing we didn't get to, which was the Main Street businesses, but I happen to be familiar with it because I do a lot of work with SBDC, Small Business Development Centers. There are 1,000 of them across the country, as you may or may not know. And so this is a challenge actually for Steve Blank. One of the things that I talked to them about the centers, there is I would say a very strong demand for a modified lean launchpad curriculum program for Main Street businesses. What happens is that each of the individual small business development centers, they're doing the best they can. They come up with a just getting started program. They're all unique. And I think that they could certainly benefit from, what at universities you've learned from the lean launchpad, lean startup approach.
Thank you very much, Philip. I appreciate that. We're going to have to move on because the schedule has 10 minutes and 8 people to make their comments in 10 minutes. So Jim,
I'll be quick.
I'll be quick.
Yeah. So Ellen Sloan talked about Greater LA focusing on Main Street, getting businesses online, giving them social media skills, coaching on the canvas as a critical thing they were doing. Keith McGregor mentioned going in Puerto Rico and that the teams aren't done at the class. In fact, they were actually starting a real business during the class and talked about a need to extend beyond the canonical I-Core to post-class curriculum. John Cable mentioned from Western Massachusetts where they're not doing big tech spin-outs, but they're actually going to be doing more local business in nature to understand how the larger ecosystem can be part of that. We also talk about the need to track more than team activity, more than just interviews. but to measure engagement with mentors and instructors and the insights that come from those engagements. Normal class, the questions come from the students, the answers come from the instructors. Very often it's inverted, where we're asking the questions for our students to figure out. Lots of pivots come from the engagement. So the activity, the engagement, and then the insight. There's three kinds of mentors that were talked about. There's the process mentors, kind of knowing what's coming up, technology mentors, and then market mentors. Zoom makes it easier to have more people involved, as someone already mentioned. We're also not restricted by the size of the classroom. So this year at Berkeley, we've gone from 8 teams and 32 students to 16 teams and 80 students. And I think hats off to Stanford's Hacking for Recovery as a first mover, showing us how you can creatively increase the size of the cohort using breakout rooms. And we'll make a lot of mistakes in the process. Apparently, the national program is now tactically mandated office hours every week. I know that at Berkeley, in the beginning, and Jerry, we've always done that, part of the engagement. And heads up for new tools, Class EDU has been developing Zoom for education. I think we're lined up to be a beta. Michael Chasen, who started Blackboard, has created this virtual connectivity that addresses some of the deficiencies of pure Zoom. And I'm excited to see what they can do to the process. And that's it, Jerry, back to you.
Thank you, Jim. Mike Moresco.
Yes, I also will try to be extremely concise. So, and just highlight some of the key insights that came out. So in the area of innovation, the concept of drive-in demo days, it was done in Florida, which I had never heard of before. I think that's a really interesting idea in terms of balancing face-to-face versus not face-to-face. A lot of discussion around how lots of deals are being done today over Zoom, and venture capitalists and healthcare and education have figured out how to do things on a platform that they've all had previously resisted until COVID came in, and that there's a lot of lessons learned there. Also, discussion around sweet spots for customer development when that work best with Zoom and when that doesn't work best with Zoom, and the need for greater guidance to students around that point. And then one last point around the very important role the MVP plays today, especially when you're working in Zoom, and the fact that if you can get the product. If you can get the product quickly, cheaply, and without using a lot of funding, you need to do that, because that's going to get you a lot further along in terms of what you can learn from a customer development perspective. That's
Thanks
it.
so much, Mike. That's super. Bob Dorff.
Thanks, Jerry. We had a great, really amazing group from all over the world, and just quickly, some of the key problems that came up. One is, hey, let's not forget homelessness in our encouragement of entrepreneurs to solve problems. It's been a horrible problem for decades, and it's going to be infinitely more horrible in 2021, at least in the United States and Latin America and probably much of the world. Second challenge issue, most of the interacting with students and stuff has been covered. I'm going to skip through all of that. Pushing more for diversity in founders, older people, Hispanics, women, brown and black people of all flavors, who have more pressure on them in many cases in the current COVID world than they did last year, and making sure we're reaching out to them, dealing with their personal issues as well as their business issues and opportunities. And a sort of sidebar to that is reminding girls to get into STEM and encouraging that. Some of the interesting ideas that came up, one was teaching smaller niche kinds of cohorts, more focused on a specific vertical or a specific stage of startup life, to expand the welcome mat, if you will, in those classes. Secondly, reaching out to, Jerry and I are empathetic with this, older entrepreneurs, find them, pull them into the mix as mentors, sometimes as founders and coaches and so forth. They've got time, they're willing to help, use them. Hats off to the University of Buckingham, which is not in the palace, but in an old palace apparently, where to graduate from the University of Buckingham, you must found a startup before you get your diploma. The startup doesn't have to succeed, and if it fails early enough, you get to do another one. But I thought that was a very interesting university graduation requirement. And to Ryerson College, who was in the group, I don't have all the names legibly scribbled, where incubators at the university are open to entrepreneurs throughout the community, not just enrolled students, which leads to, I guess, my second to last point, which is we as educators need to not treat solopreneurs or Main Street businesses as second-class citizens. They're embracing the risks and challenges that, you know, big tech startups are embracing, and they shouldn't be treated as second-class citizens in our classrooms, our incubators, or our meetups and things like that when we're having them. And that leads to my very last point, which is we all need to remember even more in these difficult times that many of the skills we're teaching, like problem solving and running around the brick wall or through it, are life skills that we're teaching. They're not restricted just to entrepreneurs. So that's sort of the highlights from a terrific.
Well, thanks, Bob. Thanks for reminding us.
So Jerry, I'm going to interrupt to remind everybody that Bob Dorff was the co-author of the Startup Owners Manual. His enthusiasm hasn't diminished since he was kicking my butt, helping me write the book, or actually writing the book and dragging me along with him. So
right,
thanks,
yeah. It was a wonderful startup in itself, and the honor of my professional startup career to been chosen to serve.
Bob, and we've all benefited from that. Well done, Steve. So I also want to point out to everybody that all the moderators have taken on the chore of summarizing these main points, just a few bullet points, and they'll be part of our report at the end. Thank you very much. So Tom Bedicare.
Okay, so much of what we talked about were the positive things that came out of COVID. So we were the Pollyanna group, and a lot of that about easier for teams to meet, mentors to meet, easier access to speakers. One thing that hasn't been mentioned, there was a great example from Doug at the University of Washington, St. Louis. He said 1 year ago in his class, he brought some a video connection of some Silicon Valley VCs that he thought would add spice to the class. And the students said, what, they're not in person? What is this? You know, we don't get to have people in person. Year later, he had VCs from Silicon Valley on Zoom, and the class was, this is amazing. We've got VCs from Silicon Valley in the class. And we certainly saw that in the Hacking for Defense class. Steve Blank and Joe Felker and Pete Newell had the most amazing set of speakers that came in week after week after week because they were pre-recorded at a time that was convenient for the speaker. And one of the other things just to mention was Peter from COVID-free New Zealand said, even though we are able to meet in person, that they're going to bring hybrid classes where there's remote and live combinations, which is I think another thing I think a lot of people have discovered that the benefits of adding remote to even to.
We heard from one group that that's a death zone. So it'll be interesting to see how that experiment goes. That
Well,
mixing the two metaphors.
Peter was talking about having some all in person and some all remote.
Okay,
Not the Goober peanut butter half and half.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. That's great. Dave, from the UK.
Yeah, just echo a lot of the points already made about the some of the lessons learned, build, measure, learn, after all. So we've learned a lot and lots to take forward. Just one point I'd add, you say tomato, I say tomato. Your fourth leg or fourth whatever is our third leg in Europe. So when we need some more translation here between your fourth mission and Europe's third mission about enterprise and engagement, and certainly there's I think a lot that we can learn across the water from experiences in France, in Israel, and in the UK. And the only concluding point is to really bring some of these big challenges back to students. We're still seeing too many apps for X, and perhaps not enough willingness, perhaps, on some of our students to engage with some of the really big topics of the day. And so the grand challenges shouldn't just be for the university. The grand challenges, the people who are going to respond to that should be our students, should be the next generation of entrepreneurs. So how do we mobilize them to really go after big, audacious problems rather than apps for X? So
And an
that's
echo
me.
on that, Dave, just an echo on that is the hacking for approach, like flipping, Lean Launchpad on its head, where you start with the problem rather than starting with the capability. Leans in that direction. So I appreciate that enthusiasm for that. Thank you. Hey, Paul Fox,
Absolutely.
Barcelona.
Okay, thanks, Jerry. So I know you'll rush me along because we're late in the day, but I don't want to repeat a lot of things that people have said. Just to say that for the most part, people think that we're doing better online than ever. We figured out a lot of things. In class, it's easier to get people to participate than ever, but maybe it's difficult to keep momentum, especially when you get into the hard part of customer discovery. In customer discovery, there were kind of mixed results where we were able to get more people engaged, to get more people do more interviews, and because people are more available online, but maybe couldn't go as deep and couldn't do more of the informal observation that's part of really getting to some insight. So it's more people's impressions than being able to observe the reality of what's happening. I think a few things that help is about this hybrid idea is minimizing the amount of kind of presentations and putting more of the lectures online, and spending more time in the breakout rooms in smaller groups, because this is where engagement really happens. There's a point about how community building is very challenging in this context. So even though you're able to get to a lot of the learning objectives, you're missing a lot of these intangibles. And so when we talked about what the future is, Jerry, you asked about this hybrid word. I've heard hybrid and blended a million times, and it means different things to everyone. And so one point that was made is that going forward, to have a lot of the lectures and things put online, and to spend in-person time for community building and doing more of these informal intangibles that we're missing now online.
And that's great. Let's all remember what a pioneer Steve Blank was in putting these lectures online and bringing the flipped classroom to scale. So thank you very much for mentioning that, Paul. Phil from VentureWell.
Yeah, I will also try to make this very quick. We talked about a lot of things that have been talked about. I just in summary, sort of the thread that went through this is that COVID and going virtual has changed everything, and actually not changed that much, both at the same time. And all the examples have been described of being able to increase access, and including, there were some great examples given of providing really different access, for example, enabling students in Africa to participate in programs, I think it was in Australia, which had never happened before, and was sort of an opportunity to think more broadly about where the watershed is for a particular course. The other aspect of that is that you have to think differently about the needs of that broader array of students and plan for that. There was a fair amount of discussion about the importance of actually doing good instructional design, which it was pointed out is time consuming and significant work to do up front, but it pays off in enabling much better engagement and retention, and also being ready to really understand that it takes longer for people to absorb information sometimes, and there's a real need to have a diversity of tools and points of access for people to engage them where they are and enable them to succeed with what their objectives are. also had some discussion around tools and the evolution of tools, which continues at a breakneck pace. And I think that might actually be a topic we want to have a conversation around the next time we come together.
I think that's a great idea, Phil. I just want to point out that VentureWell is a great organization, a great resource to all entrepreneurship professors. They even offer grants that you can apply for money to build new courses, etc. And VentureWell was the first founding sponsor for the summit program back a year ago today. So thank you for all you've done, Phil, to help build this community.
Great to continue as a partner.
And people should understand that the VentureWell website has enormous amount of information and data for entrepreneurship, and they also put on a great set of conferences every year as well, and usually important for our community.
Absolutely. And last but not least, Stephanie Maris, who hosted the very first healthcare Lean Launchpad I-Corps program. Stephanie.
Thanks, Jerry. You always make it easy for me by putting me last, so there's not much new that I can contribute to this discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie.
Hang on. I just wanted to reinforce, I think Todd Bache said earlier about the worldwide audience that's now possible, which is a huge strength and has network benefits that people can't always anticipate. So yeah, I'm going to stop right there. I'm doing a global online course, as you know.
Of course, you have your global online course. That's fantastic. So you are really reaching out internationally. Well, with that, I don't want to try and summarize the summaries, but I do want to say that this conversation is ongoing on the Slack channel that I will post again at the end of the program in just a few minutes. And I'm looking forward to seeing all the summaries from the discussion leaders, and we'll harvest what we can from those and put it out in some endurable way. So with that, I'd like to move to closing remarks if we can. And Steve, I'm going to ask you to go first if I can. What are your impressions of the day in a few minutes?
Well, I'll just make it very short, Jerry, which is we've built an enormous community, and more importantly, we continue to learn from each other. What surprises me is both ends of this conversation is one is how long Lean, which I thought with customer development, and then Eric's contribution of Agile and Osterwalder's contribution of the business model canvas would be kind of a passing fad, and then we'd move on to something else. But in fact, instead of just an evolutionary kind of it was better, it turned out it was actually a revolutionary sea change. And so it's lasted for decades now. And so that's been a surprise on one end. On the other end is that every one of the participants today are making this better with new insights, new tools, new observations, better ways to teach, better ideas. And in this group will be the next replacement for Lean as well. When Jerry got me into teaching, the canonical book, the gold standard, was by Jeff Timmons on how to write a business plan. And it was the best book ever written on how to write a business plan. 472 pages that basically, Jerry, what was it? The team something and something?
Technology and people.
Yeah, team, technology, and people.
Money. I'm sorry.
And it was the pinnacle of how to do that. Lean just basically said, well, that's great, but that's not the problem we're solving. I think with the changes in our community, in financing, in the nature of entrepreneurship now being everywhere, there will be something that follows. And but in the meantime, I'm just incredibly impressed about this community that just is making us all smarter as we're trying to make our students smarter. Remember what our goal is to educate a class of innovators and entrepreneurs who are not going to just make the next best social media app, but will have the next medicine or next way to make people's lives better. And that's what our jobs are, is to encourage that generation and give them the tools to do that. So thank you all for coming together and making our community better and our students better and ultimately the world better. Jerry?
Sure. Steve Weinstein, a few closing comments.
I just want to reiterate what Steve and Jerry have been saying. I'm proud to be part of a community that seems to be growing unbelievably fast, spreading out into so many different dimensions of trying to make a big difference in the world rather than a small difference in the world. And I encourage you all to get involved on the Slack channel and look at the resources at VentureWell if you haven't, and Common Mission Project, and take advantage of them and hopefully contribute even more of the stuff that you're all doing, because I learn a lot every time I'm part of these sessions. So thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Pete?
Okay, I guess it's my chore to deliver the homework assignment then. I'll reiterate, please join the Slack channel. It is the best, fastest way we can ensure that these really rich conversations continue. But don't just join. If you have a topic that you're passionate about and you're really interested in, please nominate the topic and then volunteer to moderate the channel. If you have tools or techniques or articles or other things, please plug them into the channel. It is a fantastic growing resource for all of us. And I think as of today, there are probably 400 of us on there. But let's make sure that we continue the dialogue past today, so that when we show up in June for the next one, we're literally on a rocket ship to helping change happen in our communities. Thanks, Steve.
And my name's still Jerry, but thanks, Pete. So, boy, I get to bring it home, and I'm really glad. Can we share the slides again, please? Because I want to show the Slack channel. So we started the day with the challenge of how can we best help our students succeed in the new economy, whether their dreams are high-tech ventures or Main Street businesses. And how can we help them be resilient and have the impact and outcomes they want? And I think this discussion did address those issues, and I'm very, very pleased by that. The challenge right now is how do we move forward? And I want to reiterate joining the Slack channel, joining the community, and of course, joining us next time. And we have picked a date. It's going to be June 3rd. That's to be confirmed. But if you want to jot down on your calendars, June 3rd, and help us spread the word. There's no reason we shouldn't be sharing with each other in broad communities. And so help us spread that word. And lastly, I want to thank everyone just one last time, if I can. I want to thank our speakers who were very generous with their time. Of course, our panelists, the breakout room leads who have stuck with us all day and made this all work for us. Our organizers and outreach sponsors, GCEC, the Global Entrepreneurship Center Consortium, and VentureWell, and of course, the Common Mission Project. And especially, I want to call out Logan Potasic, who's just, been the quarterback, who's really made this all work with her team at the Common Mission Project. So thank you all, and I look forward to working with you all in this great community. It's a great personal reward for me to be part of such a movement, and I know that word gets overused, but we are a movement. And when we hear from Columbia University that they're going to add a fourth leg to the stool, I had to hear in my own ears that everybody in this room has been working in that direction for a long time. And when I look at the screen and I see all your faces, I know you can help your universities engage, and you already are. So thank you all for participating today. And I look forward to seeing you all as the year progresses in a post-COVID world. Come on, vaccines. See you all soon.